Hi, my name is Markl, and I'm here to present my paper, Algorithmic Bias and Language Variation, Understanding Algorithmic Bias in British English Automatic Speech Recognition. So in this paper, I'm making the point that speech and language technologies are an increasingly important side of algorithmic oppression. And the reason I argue this is because speech and language technologies reproduce existing language ideologies and existing linguistic discrimination in society. And I'm looking at a case study of commercial British English automatic speech recognition to make this point. And then I look at the different harms of both biased and unbiased speech and language technologies, and also looking at the sort of origins of those biases. So I'm building on this really foundational work on algorithmic oppression, which shows that algorithmic systems reproduce structural oppression. And this really rich work has really focused on high stakes domains, such as policing or hiring or banking. But I would argue that speech and language technologies are an increasingly important type of technology to consider when we talk about algorithmic oppression and algorithmic bias, both because it's increasingly common in high stakes contexts, such as hiring, but also because it's just so ubiquitous that it's one of the kinds of technologies that many people will interact with on a daily basis. And so the ways that it will reproduce linguistic discrimination or structural oppression is going to be particularly impactful. And so I'm going to start by taking a step back and looking at some prior work on bias in speech and language technologies. And I wanted to start with this question of who even has access to speech and language technologies in the first place. And when you look at, for instance, the survey from 2020, you see that 88% of languages spoken today do not have any language resources to build speech and language technologies. That means that there are 1.2 billion speakers for whose languages we cannot build these technologies because we don't have the data, essentially. And that is obviously in very stark contrast with the best resource languages, such as English or Spanish, which have 2.5 billion speakers, but only represent a tiny percent of all the languages that are spoken globally today. And those are, of course, languages that are associated with historic colonial powers, that are still associated with centers of power, with academia, with technology development globally today. And so in this way, we can begin to understand how the broader context of language and power shapes which kinds of speakers, which speakers and which kinds of speakers have access to speech and language technologies. But even once we have them in a particular variety, once we look at a local context rather than a global one, we still have disparities between different speaker groups in terms of how well these systems work for different speaker groups. So looking, for instance, at hate speech detection, there's this really fascinating paper that shows that tweets by drag queens are rated as more toxic than those by white nationalists, even though the ideas expressed by the white nationalists are much more hateful. The language that is used is different, and the hate speech detection tool picks up on the often positive or neutral use of bad language or obscene language by the drag queens, but doesn't pick up on the deeply hateful use of perhaps less obviously bad language or obscene language by the white nationalists. And of course, it's worth noting, and I talk about this in the paper, that what we consider to be obscene is in itself a language ideology. Moving on to the context of automatic speech recognition, which I will talk about in some more detail, a study from 2020 looking at 5 US English automatic speech recognition systems has shown that for all 5 systems provided by Apple, IBM, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, error rates are much higher for speakers of African American English than they are for speakers of Californian white US English, so white speakers from California. And we can see that this error rate is particularly high for Black men who are using a higher rate of dialect terms than the other groups compared here. And so this also points to the fact that we need to leverage some sociolinguistic knowledge. We need to leverage some knowledge about the way language is used by different groups to understand bias. And this really leads me to this key point that language variation is situated within a broader social context and tied to identity. So I draw on work from sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology in particular to show that how we speak is tied to who we are, and what we believe about language is also in part tied to who we are, but also has more to do with the speakers than with what we believe about speakers than what we believe about language per se. So we have all of these ideologies about correct ways of using language, about professional language use, about unprofessional language use, etc. Those ideologies have a lot to do with existing power structures. They are shaped by existing power structures and they re-entrench them. So it is the language of the powerful that we consider to be prestigious, and it's the language of the marginalized that we don't consider to be prestigious. And similar judgments are all related to this sort of broader social context and these broader social judgments that we make about people and these broader structures of oppression. And it is this context in which we then build speech and language technologies, which may or may not be biased, and which may reproduce these existing structures. So looking at a case study of this, I was looking at two automatic speech recognition systems provided by Amazon and Google respectively, and I was testing read speech by speakers whose first language is English and speakers whose first language is not English. So L1 speakers of English and L2 speakers of English. And what I would find is that there are significantly higher error rates for both systems for the second language speakers of English versus the first language speakers of English. And this reproduces a much broader pattern of linguistic discrimination where, for instance, second language speakers are often discriminated against in hiring contexts in Anglophone countries, where second language speakers are often judged to be less knowledgeable, less educated, etc., etc. And then I was testing those two ASR systems on different varieties of English spoken in Britain. So I was only looking at L1 speakers of English, but I was interested in how different varieties how the system would do with different varieties of English within Britain. And I found that they worked best for speakers from Cambridge and for speakers from London, and which are highly prestigious varieties of English, especially the English spoken in Cambridge. And I also found that they worked worse. So they are significantly worse for the varieties in pink. So they are significantly worse for speakers from the north of England, from places like Bradford, Liverpool, Newcastle, and also for Northern Ireland, so for speakers from Belfast. And this really reproduces long-standing language ideologies within the UK as well, whereby these varieties from the south are considered very prestigious and these varieties from the north are not considered prestigious. And so to briefly think about the origins of this bias, as we all know, data is socially constructed. It's not a naturally occurring resource. It's something that is socially constructed. It reflects and can reproduce the context it was produced in. Once we use it in machine learning, it will reproduce this context. And of course, this context, the world that we live in, is sort of saturated with structural oppression. It's saturated with bias. And in the context of language, the structural oppression, as we saw earlier, really shapes whose language is included when we build language technologies, and it shapes, and as a result, it also shapes who can access these technologies, who can use these technologies. In the case of commercial ASR, that may be because of where the customer base is. It may be because of which customers are targeted by a particular company as desirable customers, as I talk about in the paper. It's looking at the harms of, for example, biased automatic speech recognition, which so speech recognition that works better for some speaker groups than it does for others. We obviously have, for example, less accessible voice user interfaces. We have less reliable automatic captions, which are increasingly important. But we also have these high stakes contexts where errors, especially higher error rates for already marginalized groups, could be particularly harmful. So those are contexts like hiring and court transcription and medical transcription. But it's also worth noting in this case that even if we don't have bias per se, these things could still be harmful in that they reinforce these existing linguistic ideologies. For example, what counts as professional speech in these automatic hiring systems that rank applicants based on a video. Who has access to the more professional speech is something that has a lot to do with who they are and what groups they belong to, and whether or not if they belong to marginalized groups, they're more likely not to have access to the professional way of speaking. And in any case, they shouldn't have to in order to be suitable candidates, right? And so lastly, this really brings me to this closing thought in this paper and in this talk, that I think bias is sometimes not the only or the main problem. And Julia Powles and Helen Nissenbaum talk about this as bias being a captivating diversion, which I think is a very useful turn of phrase, because sometimes the problem isn't the technology per se, but it's the sort of task it's being applied to, either because it's based on troubling or wrong assumptions, or because it's fundamentally unsolvable, or because it's fundamentally harmful, whether or not we use AI. And this focus on fairness and bias can really distract us, I think, from questioning the tasks in the first place. And so I hope that this paper also invites us to think about this a bit. And I hope this was interesting, and you can find my full paper at FACT 2022. And I'm looking forward to any questions you may have.